This is it, folks. This is the great debate of our lifetime. This debate is played out on virtually every newscast and at virtually every dinner table, especially around Christmas when extended families get together and argue with each other. This is the big one. Almost everyone has an opinion on this debate, and who's to say who's right and who's wrong? Everyone thinks they're right, of course, but that doesn't mean that everyone is in fact right. What I'm talking about is the role of the state in regulating the market. It's important that we consider the role of the state because the future of work is obviously intimately tied to the future of market regulation. Although it's somewhat of an oversimplification, there are two primary schools of thought on the normative role of the state. Those on the left, we'll call them progressives, who want to see greater regulation and state-orchestrated wealth redistribution, and those on the right, we'll call them conservatives or liberal conservatives, who argue that free, uninhibited markets are by far superior to state regulation when it comes to efficiently allocating resources. Are you ready? All right, let's do it. How do I know if I'm a progressive or a liberal conservative? By the time most people reach university, as you have, they already identify with either left-wing, centrist, or right-wing politics. Most typically, younger folks tend to hold progressive politics, and older people tend to be more conservative in their outlook, although there are obviously exceptions to this. Liberals, and I say this in the Adam Smithian sense of the word, not in the way that Americans call progressive liberals, are fairly easy to define. They believe in smaller governments, freer markets, individual rights, and the sanctity of private property. Liberal conservatives are right-wing, but they are not to be confused with the far right, which includes Nazis and fascists, neither of whom prize freedom, obviously. Progressives are somewhat more difficult to pin down because they are a bit more heterogeneous as a group. Traditionally, they've been proponents of greater state regulation, Keynesian wealth redistribution, the welfare state, and collectivist values. They can be situated on the political left, but again, they should not be confused with totalitarian communists. Increasingly, however, progressives are proponents of identity politics, a framework that looks at people in the context of their social group membership rather than as unique individuals. Why are we excluding the far right and the far left from this debate? Well, that's an easy one. Because both communism and fascism or Nazism are just plain wrong. It's that simple. They've proven themselves wrong time and time again. There's never been an example of a successful far right or far left society. Think about it. Have a look at recent history and you'll see what I mean. Fascist societies like Nazi Germany, Mussolini's Italy, Franco's Spain, or Pinochet's Chile have essentially gone extinct because they do not deliver net positive outcomes to the people. By the same token, no communist country has ever been successful in raising people out of poverty. But wait a minute, you might be thinking, what about China? Isn't China run by the Communist Party? Well, not exactly. The Communist Party of China is communist in name only. The Chinese abandoned sort of Marxian communism in favor of more liberal free market reforms under Deng Xiaoping. So it was not actually communism that resulted in China's economic growth, but rather the adoption of free, or at least freer, markets. In short, I think we can throw fascism and communism, the far left and the far right, into the dustbins of history. Okay, so really what we're debating here is the value of free market capitalism versus state-regulated capitalism, right? Well, that's a bit of an oversimplification, but in essence, yes, that's correct. Most people agree that free markets are good. Even places like Sweden and Norway, which are incorrectly described as socialist states. Like China's Communist Party, they are socialist in name only. A better way to describe these Scandinavian economies is social democratic capitalism, which is a robust form of progressive politics. The market is less free in Sweden than it is in, say, the UK, but both countries are still capitalist in that they protect private property and are characterized by some degree of inequality, but obviously the level of inequality in Sweden is lower than it is in the UK. In this sense, the debate is relative. It's not a question of should we redistribute all wealth equally, which is a form of communism, but rather a question of should the state play a greater or a lesser role in regulating a market economy. There's very little disagreement that more or less free markets have lifted huge portions of the world out of poverty and led to unprecedented innovations. What are the arguments in favor of greater state regulation and more progressive politics? Well, progressives often point to a moral case to defend state-led wealth distribution. They argue that extensive wealth inequality is abhorrent and ethically intolerable. When 1% of a country controls more than 50% of its wealth, then progressives argue that the state needs to step in and tax the rich so that some of that money can be redistributed to the poor, or at least to those who need it more. But in addition to this moral case, progressives can also point to a potential economic case for wealth redistribution. This is the essence of Keynesianism. In short, progressives argue that capitalism is inherently unstable, as we've already discussed in relation to universal basic income. The progressive economic case is based on the idea that redistributed wealth from the top 1% to the lower 99% will lead to increased consumer demand and thus increased consumption, which in turn will strengthen the market economy. How do liberal conservatives respond to the progressive arguments? Conservatives who favor free markets and smaller governments point out that inequality isn't necessarily a bad thing. Some degree of inequality, of course, can serve to motivate members of the lower 99% to work harder in order to accumulate wealth and join the 1%, or at least work their way up the hierarchy. Indeed, they point out that inequality is a natural phenomenon. It is, in fact, typically the case in nature that a small number of organisms will control the majority of resources in their environment. Liberal conservatives argue that there's nothing moral about significant wealth redistribution because in the long term, it leads to less innovation and lower levels of economic growth, thereby disadvantaging everyone, rich and poor alike. Liberal conservatives also believe that the private sector is much more efficient when it comes to resource allocation than is the public sector. They believe that overregulation kills jobs and motivation, resulting in market inefficiencies similar to those in former communist countries. Okay, so what alternative do the liberal conservatives offer? Well, in short, the proponents of economic liberalism posit that individual freedom and individual rights offer the best outcomes for both individuals and for societies, and that's key to their argument. They present a vision in which every citizen is free to accumulate as much or as little wealth as he or she wants. They argue that inherent to a free market is an invisible hand that will steer people towards greater innovations and productivity and performance. Yes, there will be some who gain more than others from this system, but in aggregate, everyone will be better off with freer, less regulated markets and unconstrained choices. They believe in individual responsibility, and they reject the idea that otherwise perfectly capable citizens are entitled to handouts. They point to the fact that economic growth from the Industrial Revolution in the UK and the US to the aforementioned liberalization of the Chinese economy follows from increased freedom. They don't oppose all forms of government regulation, which would essentially be anarchy, but they argue that in general, states should refrain from regulating the market as much as possible. So, which one is more likely in the future, progressive capitalism or liberal conservative capitalism? Well, that's a good question. I think it can be answered in one of two ways. First, which regulatory paradigm is more likely in the future? And second, which would be better for the future? These are two separate questions, you see, both of which are hard to answer, but the second one I would say especially so. Based on recent economic history, I would say that it's likely that state-led regulation will increase in advanced Western countries and perhaps decrease in developing countries, as we saw with China and some other East Asian countries in the last couple of decades. The nation state is more interventionist in Europe than probably anywhere else on Earth. And aside from the UK's recent movement towards Brexit, there doesn't seem to be much appetite, at least in my view, to introduce liberal free market reforms. Equally, in places like North America and Australia, the state seems to be sticking its nose into economic affairs more and more. Even, you could say, this is the case with the current Liberal government in Australia. But I think the more interesting question is not how is capitalism evolving, but rather how should capitalism evolve? Okay, so how should capitalism evolve then? Well, I wish I had all the answers, friends. I really do. But who am I to tell you how you should think? Perhaps that statement in and of itself should tell you where I stand on this debate, but I digress. It's important for you to figure out for yourself where you stand in relation to the future role of the state and regulation. Are you a progressive or a liberal conservative? How sure are you that you're correct in your position? What evidence would it take for you to change your political views? As I said, this is the biggest debate of our lifetime, and I just hope that we get it right. Rather than having just one podcast, as we've done in previous weeks, we're going to have two podcasts this week. One from a progressive making a case for more state regulation of the economy, and another from a liberal conservative arguing for freer markets and less regulation. By presenting both sides of the debate, you'll be able to make a more informed choice over where you stand. This is Professor Andrew R. Timming, signing out.